In Mass Effect Andromeda's multiplayer, you are part of an Apex team, the best of the best the Nexus has to offer. While not a regular group of soldiers, they are nonetheless talented individuals that take on the most dangerous and important missions in this new galaxy. In this series, we are going to take a look at the various class builds for the various characters in the game's multiplayer. So with that in mind, I'm Darcblade, and let's take a look at our next Mass Effect Andromeda multiplayer character, the Human Engineer. As always, remember that these guides are aimed at the harder difficulties in the game, looking at characters who are level 20, rank 10, although later in the video there will be suggestions for lower ranked characters so long as they still are level 20. The Human Engineer, in all honesty, was a tricky class to get used to. On paper, he seems pretty straightforward, but if you look more closely, he becomes a very useful debuffing character. As with most of my characters, I like to use abilities that are unique to them. So, for example, with the Human Engineer, he is unique in the fact that he has Cryo Beam. So I wanted to make the most out of this ability. With that in mind, I started by taking Cryo Beam, putting maximum points into it, going up to rank 6, putting points into Cryo Trap over Snap Freeze. Now this is one of the most debated topics on this character, whether Snap Freeze is better than Cryo Trap. However, I've had much more success with Cryo Trap than Snap Freeze. With Snap Freeze, if you shatter a target that has been frozen, it will cause additional damage to nearby foes and freeze nearby defenseless enemies. So you can cause a huge chain of cryo explosions with Snap Freeze. However, this is very situational, and often it would not work. Also, frozen targets could be easily knocked out of their frozen state by incendiary ammo or fire abilities, limiting how effective the Cryo Beam was and ultimately how effective the Human Engineer was. Thus, Cryo Trap became more useful. This allows you to basically freeze the floor, and enemies who stay in that area will eventually become chilled or even frozen. This allows you to set up a debuffing area in kill zones or choke points. Next, with rank 5, I put points into Radius over Brittle Freeze. Now whilst Brittle Freeze is useful, Radius means that cryo traps will be set up around targets, even if they're slightly behind cover. And finally, with rank 4, I put points into Recharge Speed over Damage. I'm not really using Cryo Beam as a damaging tool, and thus Recharge Speed will allow me to use it more often and debuff more enemies and set up more cryo traps. With Assault Turret, I only put 1 point into this. I never really got along with Assault Turret. But hypothetically, if I were to put points into it, if I were to maximize it, I would probably put points into Flamethrower over Cryo Ammo, just simply because this means that I could set up fire combos with the Human Engineer. I would then probably put points into Omnilink over Damage, just because I would primarily be using the Assault Turret as a Flamethrower tool to set up fire combos. And then finally in rank 4, I would put points into Recharge Speed over Durability. I found that often on the harder difficulties, turrets and AI controlled abilities often don't really last that long, so being able to use it again quickly is probably more optimal. Next, with Overload, I put points into this going up to rank 6, putting points into EMP over Maximum Charge. This is simply because Overload, when charged up, will already hit 3 targets. You rarely get more bunched up that close together. Thus, EMP will allow me to remove shields from opponents at a quicker rate. Thus, I'll be able to freeze them afterwards with Cryo Beam. With rank 5, I put points into Anti-Shield over Charged Overload. Again, this is so I can strip enemies of shields at a faster rate. And then finally with rank 4, I put points into Recharge Speed over Damage to allow me to use Overload more often. Now with Offensive Tech, the first passive, this is where things become interesting. I maxed this out going up to rank 6, putting points into Elemental Tech over Weapon Mass Reduction. Elemental Tech means that any enemy affected by one of your tech abilities means that they'll take more damage from heat, cold and electricity weapons or abilities. This provides a great debuff on enemies that will benefit you and your team. Next, with rank 5, I put points into Anti-Armor over Anti-Shield. This is because Overload can pretty much deal with shielded opponents, thus Anti-Armor will allow me to focus on those targets a little bit more. And finally, I put points into Combo Detonator over Power Enhancement. This is so that the combo set up by my abilities will be stronger. Now, with the final passive, Support Systems, again this is another area where things become interesting. I maxed this out going up to rank 6, putting points into Tech Sabotage over Shield Reset. Tech Sabotage combined with Elemental Tech is where this class comes in potentially very strong. Tech Sabotage means that anyone hit by any of my powers cause them to temporarily deal less damage. So when you think about it, you're trying to freeze as much opponents as possible and at the same time using Overload to electrocute as much foes as possible, meaning that you're debuffing them to not only take more damage from elemental sources, but they will also be dealing less damage to you and your teammates. Next, with rank 5, I put points into Advanced Construction over Tactical Revive. This is a personal preference. It's whether you want yourself to survive more or if you want to be the team's reviver. And finally, with rank 4, I put points into tech radius over tech duration. Tech radius again comes in handy when using abilities like Cryo Beam, which allows you to potentially freeze more opponents, thus providing more debuffs against the enemy. Now as for weaponry, again it really doesn't matter too much what you take. You don't want to weigh yourself down much, as you want to try to keep that power recharge speed as high as possible, as your main role will be focusing on debuffing the enemy and not dealing damage necessarily. As for gear, go with something to either increase your tech powers, recharge speed, or survivability. Now moving on to the heart of the episode and talking about the human engineers' moves and abilities. Their first move, and unique to them at the moment, is Cryo Beam. Once the ability button is used and held down, the human engineer from their Omni tool will direct a continuous stream of supercooled particles that freezes targets. If an unprotected target, a target without shields or armor, is hit by the Cryo Beam, they will become completely frozen, unable to move. So this provides a source of crowd control. However, frozen targets can easily be broken out of their frozen state by either activating the Cryo combo, which Cryo Beam primes for, or by being hit by a flame related ability or weapon. Cryo Beam also weakens armoured opponents, so they will receive a defense debuff, meaning their armour won't be as effective as it normally is. The main issue with Cryo Beam is it doesn't affect shielded opponents whatsoever, so you need to remove their shields first. In the human engineer's case, this can be done with overload before freezing them. With Cryo Beam, the main appeal comes from rank 6, Snap Freeze or Cryo Trap. As I already mentioned when talking about the spec, both of these are viable options, but Cryo Trap, in my opinion, again seems the better option. It provides you more utility by spraying the floor, creating areas of denial against your opponents. If an opponent is quick enough though, they can still run through the Cryo Trap and receive a minimum debuff from the ability. So for example, if an Addy runs through the Cryo Trap, if they're fast enough, they won't be completely frozen. However, if they're slow, then they will be frozen solid. Snap Freeze is useful, but a little bit more situational. Snap Freeze works well when there are multiple unprotected foes in a choke point, but this can be rare, especially on the harder difficulties. One of the other big downsides of Cryo Beam is that when you're channeling the ability, as in holding down the ability button, you can be knocked out of it. So melee attacks will stop you from actually using the Cryo Beam. Also, because you are channeling the ability, it means that you're standing out in the open, potentially taking unwanted damage. The next ability is Assault Turret. Once used, the human engineer will throw out a small assault turret that will then hover in place and shoot at any nearby foes. The turret has a fair amount of health and deals average damage. After you've used the ability, you can tap the ability button again to direct the turret to attack a certain target, or if you want to, you can hold down the ability and it will self-destruct, damaging any nearby foe. Self-destructing the assault turret also comes in handy for when you need to relocate and redeploy. However, I rarely have that much success with AI controlled abilities, and the assault turret is no different here. As I mentioned, if I were to put points into this, I would probably put points going up to Flamethrower to allow myself to create fire explosion combos. The next ability is Overload. Once used, the human engineer will fire from their Omni tool an electric static discharge that will instantly strike opponents that are highlighted. It deals fairly high damage, especially to shields and synthetic enemies. Synthetic meaning robotic enemies like All Revenant and the Outlaw Hydra. You can also hold the ability button. This will charge Overload, causing it to chain to 2 additional targets, as long as they're within close distance to each other. Charging Overload also causes it to deal more damage. However, charging it will put you out in the open, potentially taking more unwanted damage. Overload is also the human engineer's detonator ability. With this, he can detonate combos such as Cryo Beam combos, or if you put points into Flamethrower in the assault turret, fire combos. You can also use this to set off your teammates' combos if need be. Also, unwritten with Overload, you have a very small window to activate tech combos. Overload isn't supposed to be a primer, but the way the game is at the moment, if you hit a target with Overload, during the few seconds that they are electrocuted, a teammate can potentially activate a tech combo from this by using one of their detonators. As Overload is electric based, any target that is hit by the ability will be electrocuted, stunning them for a brief moment. This can provide you a second source of crowd control if need be. As for the passives, as I already mentioned, this is where things become interesting. Thanks to Elemental Tech in offensive tech and Tech Sabotage in support systems, you're able to debuff opponents with your abilities. Elemental Tech as well also comes in handy for when you want to freeze or electrocute targets. Elemental Tech also comes in handy for combo detonations, but as a rule of thumb, If you detonate a frozen or brittle target, basically a target who has been affected by Cryo Beam or your Cryo Beam trap, means that they will no longer be receiving the debuff. So only activate a combo from a human engineer if you know the combo will actually kill the target. The rest of the passives are just focusing on being able to use your abilities as much as possible, as well as provide yourself with survivability. As for weapons, as I already mentioned, this is really down to personal preference, as long as you don't go over that 100% power recharge speed. The human engineer has, again, average health and shields, but on the whole, compared to the other humans, the engineer is on the lower scale. They also come with a standard jet boost, dodge mechanic, and a standard Omni Blade melee attack. Now, if you don't have a rank 10 level 20 engineer, I would still advise focusing on Cryo Beam, going up to Cryo Trap, offensive tech, and support systems, after which, if you've got any points left, maybe put them into overload. This can be tricky as you may not be able to max out the two passives, and I personally would probably go up to tech sabotage if I had to pick out the two. Overall, the human engineer was very difficult to get used to. I found it very hard to find their stride, and often they come into conflict with other classes. Classes with Annihilation Field would often overwrite the Cryo Beam effect. Also, characters who had the Flamethrower ability or Incinerate ability could also cause issues. And lastly, if you are playing with a human engineer, try not to use Incendiary ammo, as it can really cause issues. Disruptor ammo doesn't seem to affect it as much, but Incendiary ammo will really nerf the human engineer's potential. When it comes to playing the human engineer, you need to focus on just debuffing as many opponents as you can. So once you've electrocuted or frozen one target, move on to the next, and then the next, and so on and so forth. This will allow your team to deal more damage through elemental abilities or weaponry, but at the same time seriously hampering the enemy's ability to deal damage to you and your teammates. With that in mind, you'll provide a great crowd control and supporting role for any team tackling the harder difficulties in the game. But anyway, I hope this guide helps, and until next time, I've been Darcblade, bringing you a Mass Effect Andromeda Multiplayer class guide to the Human Engineer. Hope you enjoyed the video, thanks for watching, subscribe and like for more.